Over the past week, I've been rereading one of my all-time favorite books, The Black Book of Communism. This book details the atrocities of past so-called communist regimes and is the primary source for a lot of people who claim communism killed 100 million people in the 20th century. If you've ever heard your conservative uncle regurgitate something along those lines at Thanksgiving dinner, just know he probably heard it from someone who heard it from someone who got it from this book. The reason I say this is one of my favorite books is not because I think it's a particularly enjoyable read. It's not. But because it's a case study in dishonest and ideologically motivated historical analysis, and I think everyone should contend with works like these and develop the ability to challenge and refute dishonest claims. Now, before we get into this, I don't feel the need to defend all of the actions and decisions made by the Soviets, but I do believe that if you plan to criticize the USSR, or any other country for that matter, you should at least start with the truth. Not only did the co-authors of the Black Book disapprove of the main author's motives and analysis, they said he was obsessed with reaching a figure of 100 million, and that this led to sloppy and biased scholarship. I mean, the Black Book of Communism considers slain Nazi collaborators as victims of communism. Aside from this, the Black Book counts the mass murder of dissidents and rebellious workers, gulag deaths, purges, dekulakization, and more. All things that, terrible as they are, have nothing to do with communist theory. I mean, the book counts famine deaths as communist deaths, which to an extent they were the fault of mismanagement, Lysenkoism, and way too centralized authority. But this makes me wonder if they would consider the 100 million people who died due to famine under British rule in India from 1880 to 1920 as capitalist deaths. More on that in a bit. By this logic, all colonial conquests, imperial wars, famines, privatization of resources leading to malnutrition, installed fascist regimes, and other outgrowths of capitalism should contribute to capitalism's death toll? I mean, I could make the argument that everything I just mentioned is actually due to an inherent flaw with the concept of capitalism. But famines in regions where famines were prevalent prior to the rule of nominally communist governments, and killing Nazi collaborators has nothing to do with worker control of the means of production or stateless, classless, moneyless society. So for this video, we're going to use the Black Book of Communism's logic against itself. But instead of just focusing on deaths, we're going to touch on all sorts of atrocities. Without further ado, here is the Black Book of Neoliberal Capitalism. Chapter 1. Non-Communist Famines and Colonial Rule. Capitalism is an inherently expansionist concept. It seeks to grow infinitely, but it fails to consider the finite resources of our world. In cases where precious resources are found in foreign lands, measures of imperial conquest and neocolonialism take place with little to no hesitation, bilateral agreement, or respect for the cultures and lands in the crosshairs of the imperial core. During the time of British imperialism, in the span of only 40 years, from 1880 to 1920, 100 million people in India alone died under British colonial rule. Fast forward to 1943, where the British Empire still had its firm grip on the subcontinent of India, the Bengal famine was the first famine in the region's modern history to not occur due to drought. Instead, it was believed to have been a product of Churchill-era policies. Although food supplies were reduced due to the Japanese taking Burma, which was a huge source of rice, and infectious disease ruining crops, economist Amartya Sen argues that there still should have been enough food to prevent a mass starvation in the region. To add to this, rice was being exported out of India even as London was receiving and denying requests of emergency food supplies from the starving subcontinent. Instead of trying to mitigate the damage done to the colony Britain so stubbornly refused to let go of, Churchill blamed the famine on his belief that Indians were breeding like rabbits. Chapter 2. The Exploitation of the Congo and Capitalism's Role in it. The Congo has suffered from exploitation and repression since the days of King Leopold II, who subjected the Congolese people to forced labor, starvation, and extreme violence in the name of mainly rubber and ivory production. In the attempt to stimulate production and instill fear in the Congolese people, this dickbag would sever the arms of those who failed to meet production quotas. This was a brutal system of terror designed to control the people of the Congo while exploiting their lands and ushering resources off to the imperial core. After the Congo's independence from Belgium in 1960, Patrice Lumumba became their first prime minister. Lumumba sought to nationalize resources in the attempt to finally develop the Congo after the region had been decimated by colonialism. But, as is so often the case with well-intentioned leaders in the imperial periphery, he was the victim of a 7-year CIA operation that aimed to replace him with a figure who would be more friendly to Western interests. Lumumba's removal was deemed an urgent and prime objective. So naturally, he was assassinated and replaced by a brutal dictator named Mobutu Sese Seko. Seko's reign was marked with corruption and repression. He enriched himself and his cronies while the population starved. To this day, the DRC is home to resources like coltan, cobalt, copper, gold, diamonds, and more. This unfortunately means that it is still the victim of exploitation. In the face of climate degradation brought on by capitalism, a need for renewable energy is high. Batteries are needed, and the ingredients used to make them are found in the Congo. It isn't only Western powers engaging in the expropriation of Congolese resources, but China as well. In addition to companies like Apple and Tesla, capitalist Chinese firms like Jinchuan Group and CMOC operate in the DRC and compete with each other for cobalt. The scramble for cobalt, paired with the privatization of African mines into the hands of transnational corporations, created a system where Congolese people are being stripped of the capital accumulated in their country and left uncompensated. This disrupts the Congo's ability to develop their mining industries, technology, and capital formation, thus leaving them more and more underdeveloped and expropriated. All of this destabilization results in the country's susceptibility to the aggression of other adversarial interests. The DRC is filled with approximately 100 armed groups who seek to further exploit the land. Resource extraction and profit generation is not the only factor at play. Long-standing ethnic tensions between militias play a role as well. Rebel groups like the Rwandan-backed M23 aim to establish political pull in the country and gain control over mining sites.
Nchi hii ni tajiri kwa madini hasa ili jimbo la Kivu ya Kaskazini. Ni hiyo pia inaleta vita.
These militias in the DRC are responsible for mass murder, sexual abuses, and as Human Rights Watch puts it, war crimes. Years of imperialism, resource extraction, and all-around disrespect for the human beings who occupy the land has given rise to the conditions we see today. Cases like that of Alan Goetz, whose factories and network allegedly played a role in refining and exporting millions of dollars worth of gold from the DRC into international markets and American companies, serves to further fund these exploitative militia groups. According to the US Department of the Treasury, the illicit movement of gold provides revenue to armed groups that threaten the peace, security, and stability of the DRC. I say all of this in the hopes that it paints a picture of a rich land decimated and a people tormented in the name of profit generation. Chapter 3. The Western Intervention Chronicles. Indonesia, Chile, and more. 1960s Indonesia was a period of diverse political aspirations and tensions. The Communist Party of Indonesia, known as the PKI, was gaining traction and support. Not only did this warrant the concern of certain members of the Indonesian military, but the US was not in the business of allowing for a thriving communist movement in Indonesia, especially in the midst of the Cold War. Sukarno, the president of Indonesia at the time, was a figure that the Americans were not too fond of due to his land reforms and his goal of guided democracy, an idea of a more direct type of democratic involvement. His aspirations were to move Indonesia's political landscape in a leftward direction. Sukarno also openly expressed his respect for communists and revolutionaries, and he criticized bourgeois democracy. Page 79 of Vincent Bevins' The Jakarta Method touches on these frustrations of his. Liberalism and party democracy, Sukarno complained, were a Western import that pitted everyone against each other, forcing each person to fight for their own selfish interests. That was not the Indonesian way. Sukarno wanted a decision-making process based on the traditional village assembly, in which everyone got together and chose a course of action after careful consideration. In the early hours of October 1st, 1965, the September Movement, a group of Indonesian military personnel, kidnapped and killed 6 senior army generals. They claimed they were preventing a coup by these generals, who they accused of plotting to overthrow Sukarno. It was the good old preemptive coup to stop a coup debacle. This chaos didn't last all too long before Suharto, a ruthless army general, crushed the coup and blamed it on the Communist Party of Indonesia. Even though the coup had nothing to do with them, it's believed to have been the result of tensions within the military. General Suharto used this situation to incite one of the worst mass murder campaigns in modern history against leftists and supposed leftists, with the American government aiding in the lie that the Indonesian Communist Party started the bloodshed when they didn't. From 1965 to 1966, Suharto slaughtered sympathizers of the Communist Party, Giovanni women, ethnic Chinese, Javanese Abanyan, atheists, trade unionists, other alleged leftists, and more. 1 million civilians were killed, according to most estimates. Some estimates climb as high as 2 to 3 million dead. Suharto's Indonesia is widely regarded as one of the most brutal and corrupt regimes of the 20th century, and it enjoyed the backing and support of the United States. At the time, the US could not permit the rise of communism to challenge and threaten its idea of capitalist democracy. Well before the 1965 coup took place, America was already meddling in Indonesian affairs, hoping to swap out Sukarno with a regime that would be more friendly to American interests and more hostile to communism. By 1962, there were more than 1,000 Indonesians studying operations, intelligence, and logistics, mostly at the Fort Leavenworth Army Base. According to Bradley Simpson, director of the Indonesia East Timor Documentation Project, declassified documents show that the U.S. provided economic, technical, and military aid to the army soon after the killing started. It continued to do so long after it was clear a widespread slaughter was taking place in northern Sumatra and other places. A 1965 telegram from the U.S. Embassy in Indonesia to the Department of State shows American interest to use the violence in Indonesia to their benefit. Right now, our key problem is if we can help shape developments to our advantage. After Suharto officially wrestled power from Sukarno in 1967, he went on to launch a campaign preoccupied with undoing all of what Sukarno had done in his attempt to move Indonesia leftward. Suharto went on to invade East Timor in 1975, which resulted in a 23-year-long occupation and genocide supported by the US. The term Jakarta became a code word for killing leftists around the world. From Chile to Brazil, the word was used as a fear tactic, often found spray-painted in places to threaten local left-wing movements. The events that transpired in Indonesia and the American support of them were replicated time and time again throughout the world. What happened in Jakarta went on to mirror itself in Operation Condor, the campaign of regime change, political repression, and overall leftist killing that took place in Latin America with the support of the US government. In 1973, when Chilean President Salvador Allende was overthrown in a coup made possible by years of American sabotage and right-wing mobilization, check out this video for more on that, a military junta, which eventually devolved into the right-wing dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, replaced him. Pinochet was a fascist. His reign was characterized by repression of political dissidents, conservatism, militarism, nationalism, and loads of torture, rape, and mass murder. Pinochet enjoyed the support of the US when it came to his overthrow of the democratically elected socialist, Salvador Allende, who the US wanted gone. Salvador Allende nationalized mines and other resources in Chile with the goal of using the wealth generated by them to develop the country. However, this of course meant that American corporations that hitherto owned the means of production in Chile had to leave. Since American big business could no longer exploit Chile for their copper and resources, the US felt that they needed to intervene and, as they so often do, back the far right to secure their profits. Pinochet took to murdering thousands of innocent Chileans for nothing more than being accused of being leftists. He would pack students, activists, and workers into stadiums used to hold, torture, and kill political opposition. The Pinochet regime was notorious for torture. Gruesome and repeated rape was a common form used by the regime. Some women who suffered under Pinochet recall being violated by trained dogs and live rats. This anti-communist crusade took place all over the world. To quote Vincent Bevins again, the extermination programs in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, East Timor, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Indonesia, Iraq, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, the Philippines, South Korea, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Taiwan, Thailand, Uruguay, Venezuela, and Vietnam should be seen as interconnected and a crucial part of the US victory in the Cold War. American-backed far-right despots are nothing new. Fulgencio Batista's regime in Cuba was supported heavily by the Americans. Batista murdered thousands of innocent people. His cronies remained rich while the people of Cuba lived in horrendous poverty. After the Cuban Revolution, when the literacy rate and life expectancy improved, healthcare centers were built, and an overall improvement to the Batista regime was implemented, only then did the US sanction, bomb, and embargo Cuba. Even though, as declassified CIA documents point out, the large-scale murder and terror campaigns of the Batista regime have not occurred under Castro. I'll close out this section with a quote from Kurt Vonnegut. Dictatorships to the right are much closer to American ideals than dictatorships to the left. Chapter 4. Corporate greed. If something doesn't generate profit, it's disregarded. This approach, from the outset, is inhumane. We produce enough food to eradicate hunger worldwide, but feeding the hungry isn't profitable, so surplus food is often destroyed instead. As a result, approximately 9 million people die each year from hunger and hunger-related diseases, with 37.2 million people currently facing emergency levels of hunger according to the World Food Program. In addition to hunger, millions die each year due to lack of access to clean drinking water, another resource that can be provided to all, but it isn't profitable to do so. Treatable illnesses illnesses, both in developing countries and in wealthier nations like the US, claim lives every day because those in need are unable to afford care. Preventable child mortality is also prevalent, with around 6 million children under the age of 15 dying annually, largely from malnutrition and treatable conditions such as pneumonia and malaria. Although we have the means to save these lives, capitalism prioritizes profits over people, shaping a worldview that deems saving lives unimportant unless it's financially rewarding. This economic system is not only unsustainable, as is proven every time we get to the bust part of the boom and bust cycle, but it's also morally bankrupt. I'll close this out with a story. In the early 20th century, the United States Radium Corporation, the USRC, refined and extracted radium to produce luminous paints, supplying radioluminescent watches to the military as a defense contractor. The company employed hundreds of workers, most of them women, to paint watch faces and other materials with radium. Fully aware of the dangers posed by radium exposure, USRC's owners and scientists took great care to avoid direct contact with the substance, using tongs, masks, and other protective equipment. However, they misled the women who worked with the radium, assuring them it was safe and requiring them to handle the hazardous materials without any safety precautions. The women were even encouraged by the USRC to use their mouths to keep the shape of their paintbrushes whenever the radium-contaminated bristles would lose form, all while being paid just $3.75 per shift. As a result, many of these workers became ill and dozens died. When the women tried to sue the USRC, they faced immense difficulty finding legal representation willing to challenge a powerful corporation. Yet the media attention and public solidarity surrounding the case eventually helped bring down the corporate stronghold, setting legal precedents and sparking the implementation of labor safety standards. I tell you this to highlight yet another example of the prioritizing of profit and market expansion over human life. But it also serves as a reminder that if it weren't for people like you, people willing to challenge this system, willing to fight for the rights of the worker, for the downtrodden, we wouldn't have the regulations we have today. We wouldn't have the 40-hour work week. We wouldn't have worker protections or civil rights. These are not minor achievements. Collective efforts have proven to work in the past. There's no reason they can't work in the future. So next time someone tells you that communism is a death cult, send them this video. That's enough out of me. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And if you dislike the video, give it a thumbs down and subscribe. Thanks.